we're going to do a flex plate check demonstration, and the purpose of this is so that you can figure out how to check your own car and make sure that the parts that are needed to be checked are done properly. And once that's done, you'll know what your car is doing, and at that point then you have started a baseline so that the next time you check it, you'll either know that it's moving or that your work has been successful and you don't need to check it in the next 5,000 miles. My suggestion is that when you first do this, you're going to take the system apart, look at it, measure it, and then write down the numbers on the flex plate cover, the bell housing. Let me go over here and grab this for a second. Any car that I work on is going to have a mark on the bell housing, and it'll have a date, and it'll have the clearance that I found. So sometimes I'll put Mrmerlin on there or not, but it's not necessary. But the significance of that is that the next guy that looks at this, if it's a mechanic and not you, is going to say, okay, well, it looks like somebody might have been in here and this is the clearance that they found. And I always leave the clearance in inches because we're Americans. I mean, you could do metrics, but for the sake of doing this, my gauge reads in inches. So that's what I'm using. In this case, the last check was done on this car at 619. So it hasn't driven too far, maybe 4,000 miles, 5,000 miles. But anyway, that's what I do. So you'll know if you get a new car and you look at that and it's automatic and it has yellow writing on it, I'm probably the one that did it. And that's not too far a thing. I do a lot of these. The other significant part of the system is that if the car's never been checked, the rear pinch bolt usually is loose. And what happens is that the pinch bolt stretches. Okay, the pinch bolts are made of high-grade steel. They're very strong, but they can be damaged. And usually the damage that happens to the pinch bolts, either the drive shaft moves forward and it starts grinding on the shank of the pinch bolt, and or you use a bad tool and that damages the head of the tool. In either case, if a bolt's been damaged by a bad tool or spline damage on the shank, the bolt should be replaced. Otherwise, if it's stretched, which means you've taken your torque wrench out here and looked at it and the bolt's loose, you're like, okay, you can use the bolt again. Anyhow, so what this happens to do is I took the covers off, I took the shield off and then the bell housing cover, and I loosened all the bolts here for the back. On the S4s, you have to take these shields out of the way so that you can access the little port here where the bolt is, okay? In this case, I'm not going to take the front belly pan off to turn the engine. I've got a handy flywheel turning tool. So that makes things easier. Otherwise, you'd have to use your 27mm socket on the crank and turn the engine over by that. And then you kind of need two people, or you have to do it yourself because you don't know where the bolts are. So the bolts pretty much have to point down to get access to them. Anyway, the first part is to take the bell housing off and then take a pry bar and put it on the flywheel and see if it moves, if it's already been checked. So what we're going to do here, we're going to get up here and we're going to pry on this flywheel and see if it moves. Okay?
Where are you putting it in, Stan?
What I'm doing is prying on either side of the flywheel to the block and seeing if it moves. Okay?
This way?
It's going to move front to back. What we're going to be checking is called the thrust bearing clearance. Okay?
Yeah, there you
So in this case, you should be able to hear, well, probably not, but you should be able to hear a thunk if you're doing this close. In this case, my flex plate is not loaded, but you can clearly hear the thunk. Listen.
Yeah.
Okay, you hear that thunk?
Yeah.
Get in here. Okay. In this case, my flywheel is moving back and forth freely, which means it's not loaded. Now by loaded, what happens is that when this system is working, the engine's turning essentially a long, thin piece of metal, and there's flexibility in this metal. It can't stay perfectly rigid. Okay. On the other end of it, there's a torque converter that weighs a whole lot of weight when it's getting twisted, And as these pieces twist together, the clamps give up a little bit of grip either way, because the engine speeds up and slows down, and over a long period of time, pieces will start migrating, okay? When that happens, the drive shaft can move forward and it can start loading the flex plate, which will then push the flywheel into the thrust bearing. So the first part of this check is to just see if the flywheel moves. If the flywheel moves, then you know that the rest of the system is probably good. However, if it's never been checked, it would always be prudent to check the rear pinch bolt, because the rear pinch bolts on a car that you've never checked before are probably loose. And like I said, the bolts will stretch. Putting a stretch bolt in is a good idea instead of a new one because it's already stretched. I've never seen one of these 12.9 grade bolts stretch or break unless the head's damaged or the shank's damaged. So putting an old bolt in is good. It's already stretched. It shouldn't stretch anymore, but then you're going to up the torque. Instead of 59, you're going to use 66 foot-pounds, and you're going to put blue Loctite on the bolt, because the other thing that I saw is that someone's car didn't have Loctite on the aft bolt, and the bolt fell out. And as it was spinning, it cracked this housing here where the front of the torque tube, or the back of the torque tube, connects to the housing, and it broke it, which meant we had to take the whole system out and replace these parts, just because the bolt fell out of the coupler. It also damaged the input thing, so we had to replace that piece as well. That was done. If it would have had Loctite on it, all it would have been required was just retorque the bolt. Take the bolt out, check it. So the other part of this is that after you get this far, and let's say your flex plate's loaded, in other words, you can't move it, you try to move it back, you really want it to move back, because that means it's not pressing into the thrust bearing, okay? On a 5-speed, it works the opposite way. The 5-speed pulls the crankshaft to the back of the car. On an automatic, it pushes the crankshaft to the front of the car. So the aft side of the thrust bearing gets worn. On a clutch, your pedal pulls the release bearing back to, so that's pulling the crankshaft to the back of the car, which means the front of the thrust bearing gets loaded. So on a clutch, when you go get in your 5-speed and push your foot on the clutch and then start it, there's no oil pressure going to your thrust bearing. It would be prudent to leave your foot off the clutch, start the car, and then push your foot on the clutch if you want to do that. Because otherwise there's no oil pressure on your thrust bearing. So the oil works good when it can float the shaft. Okay?
Be sure it's a neutral before you
Well,
start it.
be sure it's a neutral, of course, absolutely. And I would always encourage anyone with the 5-speed to leave it in gear. Even though you have a good emergency brake, always leave your car in gear. Okay? If that brake does something stupid, the car's going to roll away. And I mean, it could roll into, who knows, down the hill or... anyway, let's get back on this.
So should we be checking clearance on a 5-speed?
No. Well, I mean, you could. Actually, you could. We could set this up and you could check the thing. But I'm going to get into the 5-speed on how to set up doing your stub shaft depth. Because that in and of itself will save you a lot of time when you go to install your new clutch. You should do that so that, one, you can't see what the stub shaft's doing after you put the whole thing in. But if you pre-measure it, then you'll know what the depth is before you tighten the bolts. Okay, we'll get to that though. Anyway, so let's say we've taken this system apart and now we're here and we're trying to pry the flywheel back and it won't move. And I'm like, dang it, it's loaded. Okay, and I checked the oil and there was a little bit of metal in the oil. That's another quick check. You pull the dipstick out and put the oil on a black piece of cardboard. That will show metallics, and look at the metal, look at the oil in the sun. You'll be able to see metallics. It's like looking at metallic paint. So the next step at that point is to spin the engine around so that the bolt is facing down. This bolt, I need that tool.
That doesn't look like Where'd you get it?
All right, here we go.
So how do you know where to stop?
Okay, if you show your camera up there. If you show the camera up there, you'll see the bolt is facing down. Okay? So at this point, now, I guess you can see the bolt there, okay?
Which bolt are you looking for?
This is the pinch bolt,
Oh, that one.
okay? That bolt now, when we get this far and let's say the flex plate's loaded, you're gonna loosen that bolt, and while you're doing that, you may wanna take a look at the splines and see how far back they are, because normally on one that's loaded, you'll see a lot more splines than this. Okay, in this case, it's where it should be. So you'll release this pinch bolt, and what's gonna happen, you're gonna watch that flex plate clamp start sliding back on the splines. At that point is when you're gonna take your flywheel or your pry bar tool and pry the flywheel again and see how much clearance it is. If it feels like a lot, then you know that you might have problems. But then we're gonna get our gauge out, okay? And after we do that, after we take that one loose and find out what that clearance is, we're not gonna measure it yet, then we're gonna come back here, and actually, no, we're not gonna do that yet because we're gonna have to turn this. But first, we're gonna make a check. If it doesn't, I might need to get a smaller bolt. So, anyway, I think I can do this so that. Okay.
So you've got a custom bracket made up there to hold your gauge?
To hold the gauge. And now that I have the gauge in place, now it's a simple operation to move the flywheel forward and back and see what my clearance is, okay? And this is after I've released the front pinch bolt. I've taken the bolt out, okay? And of course you'll look at it, make sure the bolt's not damaged. Once you get this measurement, write it down. You can clean the bell housing and write the numbers on the bell housing, and then you're going to go to the back, because the back is the next step. Okay, so I'm going to remove this so it doesn't fall, because it's not really in here. Well, this is what I use. Okay. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But it works good. It's a kind of a homemade clamp. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it just has to rest on the flywheel. Okay. Not the flex plate, but the flywheel. Okay. So let's see.
Stand with the cover that you took off was originally installed and had 6 bolts.
Yes.
And the back 2 bolts are very difficult to get off without dropping the exhaust
Yes.
pipes.
So
I want to address what you might do to that.
on the first time that you're going to do this on an automatic, I would recommend that you leave the F2 bolts out after you've already dropped your exhaust system. Now, on dropping the exhaust system, the thing that you have to be cognizant of is that there's an O2 sensor here that you can't really see, and the wires come out above it, and then they go through the chassis. So you've got about maybe 2.5, 3 inches of wire free play that will have until they shear. And if you drop this with the O2 sensor wires connected, you can damage your O2 sensor wires, which then means you're going to have to probably take the cat out of the car and replace an O2 sensor, because they're not, you really can't get to it. Anyway, what I do, I put a jack stand, because I work on the ground, I put a jack stand under this, and it's only going to drop maybe ½ an inch. It doesn't need to drop much to get those bolts out. Okay, the bolts come out pretty easily. So on a first-time car, you're going to probably run into maybe a 2-hour project of getting these 6 bolts loose, the bolts that hold the manifolds. Usually they're rusted and they're rounded off, and it's a real pain to get them loose. Hopefully they're so rusted that when you twist it, they just snap. That's ideal. Doesn't usually happen, but that's the best. So anyway, once you get free of the bell housing, which that's why we use my car today, because I don't want to try to find someone's car and experiment and then have to drop the manifold, and that could be all day. It's like, I got one loose, okay. So once we have this done, the free play is checked and the front flex bolt is loose, then we're going to come to the back and I'm going to spin the engine over to get the bolt facing down, and then I'm going to loosen this bolt back and I'm going to take it loose. So I've loosened these heat shields and they'll move out of the way just enough to get the plug out here. So, give me a minute, but it comes right out. And there's a hose in the way and everything, but that's okay. We can work around that. All right. So let's see what we got here. On some of the cars, when they made them, supposedly when the car was at top dead center, you could get to this bolt. That's not gospel. However, some cars were made that. That's what, if you looked at the manual, it says turn the engine to top dead center and remove the rear pinch bolt. So at some point, somebody had thought this through it's like, well, how do I know where the bolt is? Because otherwise you need two people, or you just have to do a little bit, turn the crank over a little bit till the bolt's facing down. Once you get that far, then you can see it. But in this case, we have to turn it quite a bit because it's low. So we're going to turn it that way. Go around. Let's see what we got. There's our tool. Can you see the bolt at all? Because it's facing down. It has to go a ways. It's going to go probably a whole revolution. Let me know if you see that bolt, please.
Okay, slow down. Okay, this is the bottom side.
Okay. So we got 180.
Okay, stop. Go just a little more. Just a little more. Okay. Little bit more. And come and look at this and see what you think.
That's cool. Okay. That's enough to get the tool in there.
Dan, are you going to mark your flywheel so that you know the next time that you've got that lined up?
Mark that on the flywheel. Yeah, put a mark
That's
on
what
the
I do, is I mark the flywheel. Once I figured out where the rear pinch bolt is, I marked it so that my flywheel is at 6 at 5. So that when I go to recheck it, that I'll know exactly where it's coming
You know, I never thought to do that, but I'm sure you could. That's a great idea.
Put a drop of paint on it.
So,
That's why I do it, because I
with a yellow pen. Okay, so that's a good idea, Kevin. While you have this here now that you know where the bolt is, you can mark your flywheel and say, you know, bolt 6 p.m., which is where you want it, okay? Now that the bolt's done, you'll take the tool that you're going to use. In this case, I've got this much. And I set my torque wrench to 50 or 66 foot-pounds and get on the bolt. And there's two things that you want to do when you use this tool. One, you want to be able to hold it properly, but you also want to be pushing as hard as you can into the bolt head, so that your tool, even though it's a good tool, this is snap-on, even though you have a good tool, you want to make sure that it doesn't come free, because it doesn't go in very far, and if it slips, you could be in a world of hurt to get the bolt out if you screw it up. So, and that goes for both loosening and tightening. Normally what you're going to find is that the rear bolt is loose. If the car's never been checked, it's going to probably be a loose rear pinch bolt.
Same thing on a 5-speed?
Same thing on a 5-speed. All the rear pinch bolts in any car should be checked. If it's a new to you car, this is something that you should do for the rear pinch bolt, for the 5-speed.
What did you do to get to that? What did you remove?
In this case, for the automatic, it requires removing both of these heat shields, all the bolts for them, and separating them and pushing them to the side, and then you can sneak in here, okay? This is a little bit more difficult because there's a fluid hose here, but it can be moved out of the way enough to get the bolt out, okay? Once you get the bolt out, that's when you're going to find out if you have a good bolt or it's been damaged. These bolts both have been damaged on the shank. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. Okay. It's pretty significant, but you obviously wouldn't put these bolts back in. Can you guys see these bolts?
So what caused that damage?
What happened here is that the bolts stretched, okay, and then they got loose because they stretched, and the drive shaft migrated forward in the clamp, and the aft splines on the cutout start hitting the shank of the bolt. You'll know something's wrong with it after about half a turn and it starts grinding. And you're like, this isn't good. If the bolt starts grinding, what's happening is the shank of this is now grinding on the drive shaft splines. Okay?
If that happens, you would have your front clamp loose, though, right?
The front clamp's already
So it
loose.
could slide, so you can,
Well, yes,
mechanical work will move it slightly, so.
you can slide it back. What I would do is load the flywheel to the front, put the bolt back in and tighten it, and then use a pry bar and pry the clamp, not the flywheel, pry the clamp back. So you can move the drive shaft back. And it doesn't have to move back much, because the next part of checking this is after you remove it, you want to get a bright light and shine it up through the hole and make sure that it's round. Because if you see the drive shaft in there encroaching on the collar, then you know that you need to move the drive shaft back. That's significant because you'll damage new bolts. I got new bolts here too. But these are nice brand new bolts. There's nothing written on them, but this is what you get when you order new bolts. But they're, the high strength, and you can use them. The new bolts will stretch, so you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot a little bit by using a new bolt, but if it's damaged, it's a new bolt's better than no damaged bolt, and you probably should know that it'll probably stretch. So.
Did you apply blue Loctite?
I can't hear you.
Did you apply blue Loctite on the new?
Blue Loctite on the bolts.
On the new bolts also?
Just on the bolt threads. Just on the bolt threads, not the splines. A couple people have been doing that and they reported that it doesn't move, but the more important part is that you don't want this bolt to fall out of the collar, which, like I said, I saw happen and it caused a lot of damage for nothing. So a little bit of Loctite would have stopped that from happening. Even if the bolt's loose, it's still better than that. The other thing that can happen once the bolt does get loose is that the splines can start wearing on each other and cause fretting. And that essentially wears them down, the splines on both, the collar and the splines. Once that happens, then eventually it'll shear, but that's an extreme case. Hopefully it would catch it before that. Okay, so at that point, now that we've checked everything and the drive shaft centered, you get your new bolt, you put it back in with blue Loctite, come in and torque it, okay? Then we're going to come back to the front and we're going to turn the front flex plate around and install the front bolt. But before we do that, we're going to take the pry bar and we're going to pry the flywheel to the back of the car. This is for the automatic. And the reason for that is that the way that it normally moves is forward. So we want to give ourselves as much free play in the system as possible as opposed to loading it already or putting it in the center. It's better to move the flywheel back because it's going to move forward at some point. It doesn't move back. Once that occurs, then you put the bolt in and then you can put everything back together. And you're good. And you may have your mark on the bell housing and then now 5,000 miles later, you'll check it. And then you'll take, the first thing is take the bell housing off and check it with a pry bar. That's it. If the flywheel moves, then you don't have to go any farther because it's nothing else is moving. Then wait till 10,000 miles or 10,000 miles so it'll be a 15,000 mile check. So essentially what you want to do is establish a baseline for your drive line so that you don't let it go too far and kill the engine. And if you're driving and your car keeps shutting off after it's warm, it idles down and gets slower and slower and shuts off, the first thing you should do is check your thrust bearing clearance. Because that's the prime indicator of that it's loading the system.
Stan, would you explain, there may be some people here that don't know the damage that gets caused, so would you explain why doing this is so important?
Okay. So what's going to happen when the engine gets loaded is that there's 5 main bearings in the engine, okay? And the thrust bearing is located on the middle web of the block, so the number 3 bearing. And on that bearing, there's 2 round collars on each half of the bearing, okay? And the crankshaft has a polished surface that rides on the thrust bearing. So once that's happening and the engine starts getting loaded, it starts pressing the crankshaft into the thrust bearing. When you shut the engine off and it's loaded, there's no oil pressure the same way you do with a clutch. by pushing the clutch down and starting the engine without it being running. There's no oil pressure. Eventually, the amount of pressure is so great on the thrust bearing, it can start wearing in, the bearing starts seizing into the crank because there's no oil pressure there when you crank it. And it's the same thing like holding the clutch down, except it's worse. Eventually what will happen, the crankshaft will migrate so far forward it'll wear the bearing out, and then it will push into the web of the thrust bearing support, and then it'll crack the block. That's the worst case.
So, and that's either automatic or manual?
That's in an automatic, okay? Now, if for anyone that has an automatic car that's never done any of this, and let's say it's pre-85 or pre-83, you should always check the flex plate or remove the bell housing and make sure that the flywheel's not loaded, okay? Because virtually every car that has an automatic with a torque converter at the back, the bolt is probably loose. It doesn't matter what year it is. So it would be prudent for anyone that has any year 928 to make sure the flywheel's free and make sure that the rear pinch bolt's tight. Okay? Now, does anyone have any questions on the automatic system?
Some of the automatics probably have a secondary clamp put on, because that's been
Okay.
popular. You want to talk about secondary clamps and et cetera?
If you add a secondary clamp, that adds in clamping force, okay? The part of that, though, that you can't do is the rear. So you can make one side tight, but if the back can't be done, the back can still migrate. But now that you've checked it, you've reduced the chance of that continuing to happen because you've already checked the bolt. So adding a front clamp is good. I postulate that if you check the system and go through it without any extra clamps, it will probably be okay, unless there's enough spline damage where the clamp can't clamp tight enough, and in that case, and it starts migrating, then I would put a clamp on it. And if it still can't be stopped, then you may have to take the system apart and replace the rear flex plate clamp, because that's probably damaged, because it's been operating with a stretch bolt. And like I said, it starts fretting, the clamp can't clamp as tight because the splines are both wearing on each other. A car that's been parked over damp ground for a long time will get rusty, and the same thing will happen. The rust will accumulate on the splines, even though you can't see it. That's what happens there. Okay, go ahead.
85 automatic. You said something that was really concerned me, because as I start the car when it's already warm, the tires drop down and I have to restart. So obviously what you're talking about is something I ought to get myself involved with, or it doesn't panic very quick.
Well, right now for you, the first thing I would do is pull the dipstick out and get a piece of black cardboard and drip the oil on some cardboard and look at it in the sun. You can look at it with an bright LED light. That would work too. But what you're looking for is metallics in the oil. If it's got metallics in the oil, then you should immediately have that done. It shouldn't be, don't wait, because it's constantly adding pressure to the thrust bearing. Eventually it'll wear it out, and then the engine will be
The second
trashed.
part of that would be this, so I start out with a question. The issue of the automatic transmission and the shifting, there should be a bit of a snap between each gear. I mean, it isn't, it really makes a pop. Is that?
If it has what's called a flare, you may need to increase the pressure at the modulator. Take the cap off the modulator. The modulator is right here. If you can get a picture of it. All right. The modulator is right here. Okay. There's a little black cap on it. All right. You'll take the cap off. And I'm not going to take it off because it's on there. But it's flexible. It's been replaced because the one that was on there before was disintegrating. And I put DC 111 on here, which is why it's slippery. And I can't get it off. But that's okay. Inside that cap, there's a little metal T-handle. You'll pull it out and you can turn it. And turn it clockwise. You'll turn it maybe a quarter of a turn and put the cap back on and try it. What it's going to do, it's going to increase the pressure that gets sent to the bands, and that will give your shifts a little bit more, but you don't want to go too much. And obviously the first thing that you want to do is get a pressure testing unit and hook it up to the line and see what the running pressures are. because you could have other problems, but that's going to segue into how old is the transmission fluid. If the fluid hasn't been changed in a while on a filter, the first thing to do is change the fluid. Okay? Put a filter, fluid, drain the torque converter, put new fluid in it, use Dextron 3, 4, 5, and then put it back together. And if you still have the flare, then you'll add some turn to that. If you can get a, what's up, brother?
Quick question. The 86 and earlier, did they have a circlip on the front of the drive shaft?
That 84 or 83 and earlier had, 84 and earlier, okay. 84 and earlier had the clamp, but you know
There was a
what?
ridge in the shaft and there was a circlip.
I took Ruby's bell housing down and it was loaded. So, any 928 that's an automatic, you should take the bell housing down and make sure the flywheel is free.
So even a
It
pre-85.
doesn't matter. Take it loose, inspect it, get a start. Check both bolts, and you should be good.
Did you measure the front yet?
I did a demonstration, I didn't do it, but I mean, it moves both ways, it's not loaded. I have to figure it's good where it is, 0.006.
What tool did you make for holding the dial indicator in place?
It's just a bracket from, I think, an AC unit. It's homemade stuff. You'll come up with something. What's up, buddy?
When you're measuring the free play, what's the appropriate or acceptable values? You said
Okay.
0.006.
That's a good question. I use inches. So nominal, it's somewhere about 6 thousandths, okay? And maximum in inches is 16 thousandths.
Okay.
Normally, you'll see between 8 and 12 thousandths.
And that's the total amount of
And
play?
the total amount of play, and then the Porsche play is 0.40 millimeters. And like I said, I use the inches because that's what my gauge is. But the max is 16 thousandths. Questions? Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how to set up your stub shaft when you're working on your clutch on the 5-speed guy. Okay. The system works good. And, I mean, it has a couple flaws in it, but whatever. It's old school. And it works backwards compared to most other systems, because it pulls to the back. Most systems push to the front to release. Anyway, what I do, I separate the bell housing from the engine by removing the 4 bolts back to 2 or 3 turns loose. So they're all 4 of the bolts are in the bell housing, but they're loose, and there's only 2 or 3 turns holding them. And then I'll remove these 2 these 2 transmission bolts and slide the torque tube back. Okay, what that does, it gives me clearance to get the clutch out. There's no pins having to get messed with. Even though if you put your U-bolts in there to help get the release arm off the ball, you'll still have a little bit extra clearance to drop the clutch pack out.
What's another way of doing it without doing the rear transmission loosening?
That's how I do it. Every time I've not done it that way, something jams up and I can't get the clutch out. Then I have to go back and do exactly what I just told you and slide everything back. And so I just do it. Okay? It may come out, it may not. I'm not guaranteeing anything. So once that happens, you have your clutch pack on the ground. Now you got a stub shaft. Work it this way. You have a stub shaft and you got your first disc, intermediate plate, and a second disc, and then your pressure plate, and then a throw-up bearing. And it's always maybe 65, 80 pounds, somewhere like that. So, and then you also have a guide tube collar that comes out with the thrust bearing, or the throw-up bearing. So what I do, first I'll replace the pilot bearing if it's going to get replaced. I'll bolt the engine back to the bell housing, because I need a measurement what the system together. Once that happens, I'm going to take the guide tube collar and I'm going to take the stub shaft and I'm going to put them both back in the car, just with this. Okay? I'm going to bottom the stub shaft into the pilot bearing. Okay? The collar is bolted to the support in the bell housing. Okay? It's all connected back to the block, so you're going to get an accurate reading. And once I have that, I'm going to look and I'm going to watch that stub shaft come out of the bearing about 3 millimeters. And on the end of that stub shaft, there's a raised portion, which you're essentially going to center that portion into the back of the pilot bearing so it runs in the center of the pilot bearing. What you're trying not to do is bury this into the back of the pilot bearing, because it'll damage the bearing. If this moves into the pilot bearing, you can kill the pilot bearing, because it's essentially loading it into the back of the bearing. Instead of the bearing, doing what it's supposed to do, support a load, it's now getting thrust in addition to having a load. So once that happens, you have it set. Then you're going to go to the back of the guide collar, okay? The guide collar will be back here and the shaft's coming through, and then your clamp is back here, okay? Take a marker and mark a scribe line, yellow paint works. Then you can put this system back in, and then when you have it all back together through the disc, you load it back up there, get the collars in, and put the engine back together, and then you can see where your stub shaft is. If it's too far in, obviously you have to get it out. If you can't get it out, then you have to put a clamp on it and pry the clamp back. That will move the stub shaft back. But once it's set, you'll be able to see exactly where it is, and then you know that you haven't preloaded the stub shaft into your pilot bearing, which can damage the pilot bearing, and eventually you have problems with everything else. So that's the significance of doing that one little task. It takes about 10 minutes to do, and then once that's done, take the stub shaft and collar out, separate the engine and whatnot back, and then you can put your clutch pack all back in together, hook the release arm back on, and then put the bolts in and put it back together.
Thank you, Stan, for the excellent tech session, and thank you also to our 928 Frenzy event sponsors.